Welcome to today's talk. I'm Pernille Berg, and with me I have Sinus Lynge, and a huge welcome to you, Sinus Lynge. Thank you so much for being with me today and having this conversation with me. And to start it off, I was wondering, could you introduce yourself a little bit and your background?
Yeah, I can do that. First of all, thank you for inviting. It's a huge pleasure, and I've been looking forward for this conversation. So my name is Sinus Lynge, and I'm one of two founders of the Danish architecture company EFFEKT. We are around 60 people sitting on the floors here just behind me in Copenhagen, working with urban planning, architecture, and landscape as our kind of main focal areas. But apart from that, we also have a R&D department that is an integrated part of everything that we do, in which we try to ask some of the bigger questions that our industry and all industries are facing these days. How do we fast forward the green transition of our civilization, specifically our cities, buildings, and the landscapes that we live in?
Excellent. And if you were to say in one sentence, what is EFFEKT and what is your mission in EFFEKT?
Well, like EFFEKT is the Danish word for impact, and that's the name we choose because we wanted our projects to be measured on the impact that they have on the surroundings rather than certain style or so. That's what we investigate. That's what we are here for, is to investigate the impact of architecture and urbanism. And we started off mainly focusing on that impact on sort of social and cultural perspectives, but we have added the level of looking deeply into the environmental impact of architecture, urbanism, and basically the footprint of our civilization and how that is shaped through the way that we shape our cities and our buildings. So that has become a driving agenda for the office.
And as you said, it's a huge task, and it's also a task or a mission that is receiving wider and wider an audience understanding or seeming to grasp the importance. But if you were to kind of, as you're saying, in terms of the impact architecture creates, and we have cultural impact and social impact, as you say, we know that buildings make a difference, cities make a difference, landscapes make a difference. And if we look at the environmental impact, the transition that you're witnessing, what would you say are some of the biggest insights that we have acquired within the last few years or decade in terms of the impact on the environment?
Yeah, inside the office, we've kind of given this the sort of headline of from ego to eco, which is basically the transition from seeing humans as something which is a part from nature towards seeing humans as something which is a part of nature. And that transition is bigger than the words, because if you start seeing humans literally as being part of nature, then that changes your whole perspective towards what it is being human, but also towards how our buildings are part of nature and how our cities are part of nature. And basically, I think that we sometimes forget how closely connected we are to the ecosystems that surround us and that we are part of, a little bit like a fish might forget about water. I mean, every minute we are breathing air and oxygen that is produced by plants. Every minute we are using energy that we got through eating food with sugars that basically comes from photosynthesis, translating sunlight into sugars that we then harvest and eat. And half our bodies are other organisms that doesn't have human DNA, and if we didn't have those, we wouldn't be able to digest the food that we eat. So in so many ways, in every second, every day, and every week, we are super integrated. We are little walking ecosystems embedded in bigger ecosystems. We forget about it because we have been so used to being designing our human environment that we actually think that we can control it. But the fact is that we are, at the end of the day, on a micro scale as well on the macro scale, looking at the whole globe, completely embedded in much larger ecosystems.
And I think you're pinpointing some of these complexities that we're struggling to not only accept to a certain degree, but also to become much more aware of, because there's so much knowledge in just all of the various examples that you've just mentioned. And you said there are so many different, there's so much knowledge that we have acquired now. And when it comes to the building industry, if you were to kind of look back just even the last 5 years, what are some of the greatest epiphanies or self-realizations that you as a company and yourself have acquired in that journey from explorating from ego to eco?
Well, around 10 years ago, we started a kind of research and development department to supply the traditional kind of consultancy that we did. I mean, if you're a consultant, you need to come up with the right answers, but we thought we also need to ask the right questions to be sure that we're actually coming up with the right answers. So that unit was meant to be asking the kind of deeper questions that we need to think about in architecture and urbanism and land use in general. So one of the first projects we did was looking into whether we could build communities that were self-sufficient with food, water, and energy production, which are services that we might be able to build into our cities and our homes, just like in the last centuries. We have included fresh water, heating, daylight, and other things into the way that we build architecture. I think that there's an opportunity that if we change the perspective, we can include other services and new connections with the world around us into the way we build architecture. So this is one of the questions that we have been asking ourselves. But I think the general paradigm shift that we're looking is to from when we started looking into this was that being sustainable is not about doing less bad. It has to be about doing more good. So we need to be doing good for not only people, but also for the natural environments that we are part of. And so our buildings and our cities, they need to become generous, and they need to be much better integrated with the hinterlands, but also the nature environment. And the thing is, once you start sort of unfolding that perspective, you start seeing buildings not as being permanent structures, but rather being a organization of materials that comes from somewhere. They would come out of wood. They might come out of the soil or other places, and then we put them together inside our cities and organize them so that we can live in them, just like a coral reef is a habitat for other species. And at some point, these buildings, they cease to be buildings, and then they have to go back. And that is the kind of material cycle that we need to understand for buildings. Apart from that, the buildings are little machines that actually shape our consumption of water, electricity, rainwater that falls on top of our buildings, and also waste streams, as well as emissions. So once we start having that perspective on buildings, it's an explosion of opportunities and challenges that it's kind of asking completely new questions towards architecture. And if you kind of add that same perspective to our cities, then you need to start thinking about cities like ecosystems. The city is like a forest. It needs to be providing fresh air, food. It needs to clean the water. It needs to kind of make habitats for much more species than we are currently doing. So we're just kind of, by changing the perspective as I said, from being apart from nature to being a part of nature, you're completely changing the program or the brief that we need to design for towards.
Completely, and quite frequently you hear people saying, so the challenges facing the building and industry, and one of these challenges I could phrase as a question in terms of, are the various people and companies within the building industry, are they able to ask those new questions as you are identifying? We need to ask different questions in order to create the buildings and cities to become these ecosystems that are connected to other ecosystems. Are we able to ask the right questions in order to do that?
I think we are getting there, but we're getting there too slow. What we see is a huge movement in the building industry, at least in Denmark, where both investors, developers, contractors, material producers and also consultants are starting to discuss sustainability. But we are still way back in the doing less bad paradigm, which is not good enough. And one of the big challenges that we are seeing is that the transition from what we could call kind of relative sustainable to being absolute sustainable is happening too slow. And the big problem with that is it becomes very difficult for the industry itself to differentiate. I mean, I might go out and say, we did a beautiful sustainable building. It has a green roof. Apart from that, it's based on concrete. It's built with fossil fuels and so forth. So at the end of the day, that building is not sustainable. It's part of a kind of bigger degeneration of our environment. But it's very difficult to actually define this, because we need green to be a little bit more black and white to help ourselves to set very specific targets for what we can actually define as being sustainable.
And I think you're pointing to something that's very essential, because you also mentioned the absolute sustainability and you've mentioned the planetary boundaries. Could you help me kind of exemplify or make it very concrete? When we say we have to build and design within the planetary boundaries, what does that mean, and how do we measure that?
Well, I think that's a very big question, and it's a question that we set out in effect in a partnership with Mo and Zebra, two other Danish officers, architects and engineers, to see if we could actually kind of figure out what are the planetary boundaries for global warming, looking at specifically the planetary boundary for CO2 emissions. So we started looking into this question and found out that this is, if we can find the answer, this is going to be relevant not only for our offices, but also for the wider industry. So we went to a couple of foundations and we got a bigger project set up involving a bunch of Danish universities and researchers, along with the Stockholm Resilience Center as a peer reviewing entity, to actually investigate the limitation for CO2 emissions if we are to stay within planetary boundaries. How low do we need to go? And more than that, how fast do we need to go from where we are now to that target? And that has been a project that has been a year in progress almost, and I think we'll be ready to share the results in a few weeks. And the result is basically quite scary, because taking into consideration the last knowledge that we have from the latest IPCC reports, including the impacts of methane, we can see that the global limitation for human caused CO2 equivalent emission has to be lowered to 5% of what we emit today. And we expected that to be actually quite a lot higher when we started this study, but the findings of the researchers was that radical. And the next question is then, how long do we have to reach that target? And we have a global budget, which is defined in the IPCC report of 3 to 500 gigatons of CO2, which is we can overshoot the planetary boundary so that we will have some global warming, but not more than 1.5 degrees. And that's what we have agreed to aim for with the Paris Accord. That budget, if we stay within business as usual, is used up in, I think it's 5 years already. So we need a linear reduction curve that could extend the period to somewhere between 7 and 14 years, depending on the level of risk or the likelihood that we will, in fact, remain within the 1.5 global warming target. So that gives us 7 to 14 years to reduce emissions with 95%, which is a huge task for the industry. And it's quite a kind of shocking result to come out with. And it's a kind of don't shoot the messenger type of result. It's not necessarily quite fun to bring this out. And I think a lot of the stakeholders in this research have been kind of really seeking their mind on how do we actually kind of publish these findings.
Yeah, with such stark results that people will kind of say, we don't want to hear that. You know, as you're saying, these are such radical results that are also unpredicted from you. You're also surprised. So one could be, one could worry that we'll all kind of shut our ears when you present the results.
Totally. I mean, we had this feeling of being, being part of. Did you see the "Don't Look Up" movie?
Yeah, yeah.
I think we had that feeling of like these findings are so difficult to come out with that we didn't know how to share it. But we also collectively agreed that there's no way we could not share the findings. So we need to get this out, and we need to start the conversation with how to actually make the whole industry work within the Paris Accord. And that, I mean, the need is this, that we start working together and we start reducing tomorrow and we stop talking about it. So the good news that is also in this is that there are actually a couple of really good examples of buildings that are being planned and erected currently in Denmark, which are doing quite well within this. It's already, a few years into the reduction plan. So if we start from where we are now, I think there's absolutely a good opportunity for the entire industry to start moving. And I think also what we need to realize in the industry that this is a risk that is going to be very real within the next decade. So either we will be regulated by law, or we will be fast and we'll learn how to keep business as usual, but by building different than we do today. So I do think that it's a call for action, because we actually need to change, and we can do it by planning it now, or we can do it by because we will have to in a few years. And I think that's quite real risk scenario that we need to kind of see.
It's also, as you say, there is actually a choice. And coming back to what you were saying, please don't shoot the messenger, but there is good news, because one of the things that you're also saying is that there is such rapidly accumulating knowledge that can enable you to make the right decisions. So there's actually already at this point, you know how to build differently in order to do good, not just do less harm, but to do good.
I mean, the actual reason for us to start this investigation of when can we call a building absolute sustainable was was also because we were working already in a partnership with VELUX and Mo. Within the VELUX program, Built for Life, we had a specific research project called Living Places, where we were investigating kind of a new perspective of how we develop homes. And the results from that were actually so close to what we consider to be within planetary boundaries that we asked ourselves the question. So that was actually the starting point for doing the carbon reduction roadmap. But that project in itself had a lot of learnings. First and foremost, this is a project that ran for a couple of years. So we've spent a lot of time asking the right questions before coming up with the conclusions. And it's a very intentionally cross-sectoral collaboration, first between VELUX, Mo, and EFFEKT, and then later involving the contractor Enemarker Petersen to be sure that the solutions we came up with was something that we could actually realize and we could measure the results, and that we believe can actually scale across the industry. But if you look at the housing industry today, we are expected on a global scale to double the amount of housing within the next 30 years. So this is the same period when we are expected to get to net zero emissions. And as you may know, 39% of emissions are set to come from the building industry and also the operation of our buildings. So it's really important that we start moving the building industry so that we can scale solutions. At the same time, we can see that people are not necessarily becoming more happy with the way they live. 1 out of 3 Danes are wanting to have become better parts of local communities where they live. They feel lonely. We have stress epidemics across the globe. And also we are living in indoor environments that are not healthy. They're like 2 to 5% more polluted than the outdoor environments. So actually 1 out of 3 European children are living in unhealthy indoor environments. So if you quote the Harvard professor, I forgot his name, but what he says is that it's more important for your health which architect built your house than which doctor you choose, which is pretty scary for an architect, because we are not experts in the indoor environments. But fortunately, VELUX and Mo had done a lot of research on that. So what we tried with that project was to combine planetary health with the health of people. So kind of a planet and people perspective.
And I think it's actually a really good point, because quite often when it's the sustainability agenda is raised, as you started out by saying, a lot of people will say we're doing less harm. But the connection between the sustainability in terms of absolute sustainability, and I'm talking about architecture here, also have other benefits. So when you start looking at the organisms in terms of the materials you choose, etc., those choices can also have quite positive effect or impact on the health within the building. So it's not just so the interconnectedness of these agendas, I think, is also something that you are basically emphasizing or alluding to in what you're saying. And it begs the question that when we know that we will have to double the building because there's a population increase globally. I think I mentioned to you the example that I was told by Jakob Brandberg Knudsen for the Royal Academy, that 100,000 health clinics will be built in India within the foreseeable future. So how do we make sure that the knowledge that you have today, that we can build within planetary boundaries, how do we ensure that we have other actors within the building industry can absorb that knowledge and the experiences?
Well, what we try to do, and what is the purpose with this project, is to build an example project. So we have done a project which will be realized and open for the Architectural Congress in Copenhagen in 23. And with that, it's a purpose for everybody to come and see and ask questions, and so that we can share what we learned. And what we did learn was, in fact, that we can build sustainable and affordable and very livable and healthy homes that are kind of performing on all these measures and still using the solutions that we have on the market today. So that project specifically reduced the CO2 emissions with 75%. So we are now at 25% of what an average Danish type house would emit, just by looking into all choices in materials, foundations, energy production, etc. So by looking into every choice that you make within that process, with that new bottom line, we could actually make better choices without producing new materials. So it's not rocket science. We can actually get like a 3/4 of the way just by using common sense and asking different questions. And I think that is an enormously empowering message to come out with, that we can actually get really far with what we already know today. And then we need to rethink how we produce, recycle materials to ensure that our homes are powered with renewable sources, etc. So there's so many parameters that we can work with. But already today, with the solutions at hand, we can get to 25% of what a traditional type house is emitting, and that is knowledge to be shared, and that is something that we would like to share with the rest of the industry, because the fact is, nobody is going to make this transition alone. We are so good at competing in the building industry, but in this competition, we are all playing on the same team. So across from investors to developers to the consultants, the engineers, the architects, to the contractors and the material producers, if we all push together and we start collaborating rather than competing, I'm actually quite confident that we can move this target very fast. But that is also the structural change that we need to make, because if the incentives stay the same, then I think it will be very difficult, because then it's kind of one company for themselves, and then you can't move a lot of
No, I think so. So basically, what you're saying is that one of the very, very positive and surprising learnings from the project of Living Places is that you can make an amazing, drastic reduction of CO2 emissions by using the knowledge that you have at hand today. Very simple practices to be changed, different materials, different techniques. You can make a huge positive change already.
with solutions and products that we can just go and buy on the internet. I mean, it's right here.
It's basically there is a plug-in. We can do it, so we can, and that can be shared, just as you're saying. So that kind of very surprising, positive, as you say, that is hugely empowering and motivating. But you also say that there are so many questions and you're learning so many new things. Are we able to absorb all those new learnings? Do you see a challenge in terms of how the massive transformation that we're facing, do we have what it takes to reach within the 7 to 14 years?
I mean, if you look at the Kennedy's space program, that was a decade, and they had no clue how they were going to actually land on the moon. So, I mean, the challenge of that was a challenge of technology. They had to develop so many new solutions to getting there. I think our challenge is a different challenge. It's a challenge of actually starting a movement where enough people from enough sectors will start working towards this and setting shared targets. And what we are trying to do, and what I think is probably one of the most important things, is that we actually visualize and specify these targets. We are not going to the moon. We might be going to Mars, some of us, but that's not the project today. It's not the most important project. The most important project is actually learn how to build within planetary boundaries in 7 to 14 years. And if we can share the knowledge about that, I have no doubt that we can get there. But it's the question is if we can change the incentives in the building industry.
Yes, and if we just follow up on that a little bit, what would you like to see change with regards to incentives in the industry to make the change within this quite fast pace?
Obviously, it would be great if we can change the legislation so that actually follows the Paris Accord, because that's not the case today. If you work within with the Danish building regulations, you're going to overshoot massively. So that's the first thing that we need to change. But then I also think that this should be kind of written targets for the big investors, for the pension funds, etc., because I believe that they are working within the Paris Agreement, and I believe that most of them have said they will, but they've never really specified the target, and that's what we need to do now, and that is kind of calling for very fast action across the industry.
So from the living places, do you have some of these like from the living places project in terms of the building principles, did you set these targets, or are these targets that you can set now based on the experiences you've acquired?
Well, the targets we set in the living place project was the target to see how far can we actually reduce. So we didn't have a fixed number on that. But from that, we asked, what is actually the target if we want to be within the Paris Accord? And this is why it's important to know that there's a budget globally for emissions before we exceed the 1.5 degrees global warming, which is the agreement of the Paris Accord. And that actually sets us on a very fast reduction path, which I think nobody in the building industry or the politicians or other industries are currently aware of or following. So basically setting shared targets is the first, that's what Kennedy did and was very successful in doing. And that's what we need now to set the target.
It's a very, 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 very beautiful way of phrasing it. So just as kind of coming to an end of our conversation and our talk and setting and identifying the target, if you are to imagine just in the next 5 or 10 years, we've set the target, what would you like to see much more of within the building industry?
Well, I think that we are in this like super exciting point in history where we are just starting to see a new era where our cities and living environments are starting to be connected with ecosystems around us. So, and that integration is something that we just started to look at a little bit. Like if you go 100 years back and you were the modernist architect just starting to understand the industrial revolution, we are looking into a much larger revolution, but we're only seeing the kind of beginning of it. And so I find these extremely exciting times. It's a huge task that we have ahead of us. We have huge risk, but we also have huge opportunities if we can actually develop cities and homes that are much better integrated with nature. And first and foremost, I think one of the things that we learn when working with this agenda is the kind of the value of connectedness between humans and nature. Like a stupid example would be a worm that you would consider a growth insect, at least when I was a kid. But my kids who are kind of taking part in gardening, in school gardens, and they produce food, they know they have completely different relation to worms because they know that they're the ones composting our organic trash, so they have a purpose, and they have a beautiful, very important purpose in our ecosystems. So this kind of, it's a simple example, but it could also be understanding how soil and plants make us happy, how fresh air is stimulating our senses also when we are indoors. There's so many examples. Daylight. There's so many examples of new connectivities that we are working with in architecture and in the way that we start integrating nature into our cities, which is like insanely interesting, and to me is the beginning of a quite big revolution. And that is in fact the kind of movement that we in our office call the movement from ego to eco. And that is exciting times, and it's a time of huge opportunity as well.
I think it's a beautiful dream, and certainly a future that we can all see ourselves in. So with that, a huge thank you, Sinus, for taking time out and having this conversation with me. It was thoroughly inspirational and enjoyable. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Pernille.